Welcome everyone to today's talk and presentation. Hopefully your attendance at the conference has been very fruitful and insightful with all the different traditions and approaches to spirituality and education. Today we're going to be conversing about the contemplative pedagogies of India and the crises that face young people. So we'll be concentrating on some specific philosophies that stem from India, how they've been applied in education systems of the past, and what we can do about their relevance in our classrooms today. Just to get a quick overview of our dialogue today, first we'll be talking about not only the crises that face young people today in schools and education systems, but more importantly, the calling of the times, the cultural milieu in the past few decades and basically after the mid-20th century, how there's a dire need for some level of spirituality and scientific thinking. Then we'll base this in the conceptual framework of yoga, Vedanta, and Buddhism, three distinct schools of thought from India. We'll talk about how they built a pedagogical system in and of themselves. And then we'll transition into contemporary revolutionary reformers who've tried to apply these styles of teaching and learning into a modern 20th century era. And now, sitting in 2022, what is their relevance in our classrooms? And how can we discuss the crisis of climate with young people today with this framework in mind? So to continue that conversation, let's really first highlight the calling of the times and the crises that face young people today. So in the past few decades of social psychology research, anthropology research, scholars have found that there's a tremendous increase in people's need for some level of spiritual alignment. While the data shows an abandoning of formal religious institutions, there's been a tremendous increase in people's participation of yoga retreats, meditation centers, etc., particularly after the counterculture movement of the 60s and the 80s. But what's really, startling to see is that in the post-pandemic era, young people have been grappling with so many issues of mental health, depression, alienation, etc., that they've also been looking for something like this. So there is a cultural calling for some level of spirituality and its relevance in their daily life. At the same time, at a recent speech given in the UN by the editor-in-chief of Nature magazine, she claimed that there is a dire need for scientific thinking today that exists outside of the classroom. In other words, young people learn physics, biology, chemistry, all the different sciences in their class, but then the learning methods and the questioning methods that they learn there end there. They abandon them when they come to think about their own belief systems, whatever societal ills they see, family structures, their own belief systems, etc. And so this discrepancy leads to just a scientific thinking within four walls. And so she called for a dire need for proper scientific outlook as a habit outside of the classroom. So this seesaw between a calling for some level of spiritual relevance, but also a scientific outlook towards the rest of their life seems to be, disconnected. And this is where we'll talk about how these contemplative philosophies of the East provide some insight. How does this connect to the crises that people face in the coming generations? We've obviously discussed the mental health, depression, anxiety, alienation issues, and the highlighted inequalities due to the internet and social media that allows for the propagation of inequities that have existed for centuries. But particularly, there is a planetary issue, and that is the climate and sustainability crisis. Not only does this affect the lives of people in developed, rich countries, but entire ecosystems underwater, maybe even tribal villages that may not have any contribution to the ozone decay. They are even suffering. So this interconnected issue is a crisis that young people face today. So we'll talk about how this philosophical framework from the East, these spiritual traditions, provide some insight on this crisis, but also how has it been applied in teaching and learning for it to prepare young people to battle it, withstand it, and transform their perspective towards it. So now let's talk about the conceptual framework through which this pedagogy of the East has been inspired. And we'll take the inspiration of particularly three traditions, although these are not inclusive to every tradition. It is a pluralistic, schools of philosophy. So there's as many paths to the truth as there are people almost. And this beauty is evident in the nation and its heritage itself. But without going into specifics and metaphysical differences, we'll talk about three specific traditions: yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism. Now, Mukherjee, in his magnum opus, argued that really all of the spiritual traditions of the East have a similar way of teaching and learning, and that is the end goal of Yoga Sutra. He claims Yoga's Chitta Vritti Nirodha is really the foundation of Eastern pedagogy. And what does it really translate to? It translates to yoga, the definition, yoga is the stilling of the fluctuating states of mind. Now, in understanding why would someone even pursue an endeavor like that, why would one even care to still the fluctuating states of the mind, these philosophers argue that we have misplaced identity and constantly trying to find identification with something external, whether it's something we own, property, wealth, clothes, glasses, etc. And as we go deeper and deeper into our own levels of identification, we realize that we are simply a witness. And this consciousness, they argue, is so powerful that it's in fact expansive and inclusive. You experience a state of oneness with not only people around you, but the environment, the nature, and the universe itself. So this process of trying to still the fluctuating states of mind begins with a level of questioning of who am I? Where does happiness lie? And this is really where the tenet of Vedanta, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, now begins the inquiry into truth, is affirmed. This process of trying to look inward begins with inquiry. Who am I? What is my place in this universe, and what is my relationship to it? And through practices like meditation, concentration practices, empathy exercises, these truths are experienced and forwarded. Now, there's a principle in Buddhism that really, highlights this concept. It's called pratitya samutpada, interdependence of all things. Now, we're not going to get into the metaphysical differences between these traditions, for they exist. And for centuries, people have written about them, debated, and they have their own paths to, enlightenment. But without going into those specifics, let's talk about the similarities. And the similarity stems from this fundamental thing: inquiry into self. Now, this can begin with a science or history lesson and can end with the experience of oneness with the people around me, the nature, the animals, the environment. And this is exactly what these teachers and pedagogues affirm, that their teaching and their intent in teaching was fundamentally this. When one begins this questioning and inquiry into self, the end experience is profound and leads to a level of love and empathy for everyone, because the end experience is oneness, equanimity. And this is the foundation of the pedagogy. Now, how does this relate at all to what a teaching and learning method looks like? And so what they propose to us is really a paradigm. It's not an interventional approach. There's various studies and journals and books all across the globe. It's almost a $4 billion industry. The mindfulness for students, mindfulness for corporate people, mindfulness for activists. It's a huge industry, and there's various practices. But what is the intent and approach of this paradigm? We just highlighted it, right? It is the idea that this inquiry leads to an experience of oneness, that this consciousness is unifying, it's inclusive and expansive. So it leads to a level of altruism and empathy, a cyclic process. And this is exactly why the spiritual traditions, whether it's in fact Eastern, West African, Aborigines, Native American, in fact, some of them even had this level of empathy for nature and animals, whether it was when they were hunting or living within mountains and forests. They felt like it was a coexistence. And so how does this relate back to the pedagogy? It does so by really three things: approach and intent, the application, and the environment. Now, there's a bunch of meditation for student practices, that really help students cope with stress, cope with, an oppressive system in an inner city. But this is interventional, and there's plenty of research that suggests that students have now the ability to control their cortisol levels, or their dopamine and serotonin is now controlled because they have advanced as meditators. But this does not necessarily alter their approach and lens to viewing the world, and that is fundamentally the intent and approach of this pedagogy. So the intent and approach we've discussed. Now the application has to do with a set of practices. It can be something like a meditation and concentration practice in these schoolings. It can be an artistic expression of self, whether it's through writing, through reading, through Socratic conversation with the educator on philosophical topics like this. And it can lead to an empathy practice. And a perfect example like this is given by the Nobel laureate Tagore. In his school, Shanti Niketan in Eastern India, he established a schooling system that almost, it was inclusive to all, whether it was from an aristocratic high caste family or somebody who came from a poor village. But one thing he required, whether it was a science, history, language class, was that the students were required to go in rural villages near the area, stay there, understand the problems, and then take whatever principle they learned in class and apply it to a solution of that area, thereby extrapolating the empathy that they're talking about in their conversations, in their writings, whatever level of equanimity they experience while having that contemplative practice of meditation or concentration, whatever it may be. So the cyclic process of looking within, but then giving outwards, affirms that reality, that identity that I truly have is a unifying, inclusive identity. And so we talked about the intent and the approach. These were the applications. But what was really unique about these pedagogical systems was the environment. The environment was as simple and as natural as possible. In other words, no matter how rich, how poor, what caste, what race the student was from, they were studying in a nature environment. They were studying in and about nature. So if it was a principle they were learning in science, they were looking at it in real time in that nature. But then they were thinking about how that principle can be applied to improve the local area, thereby improving the sustainability. So the empathy was constantly extrapolated. There was a practice to live in that environment, strip myself of whatever, delusional identity I may have. But then once I'm in that environment, how can I apply what I'm learning to improve that for the locale? And then when students were done with this learning, the idea was to go back to wherever they're from and apply what they've learned. So it's an entire paradigm. It's not an interventional approach to teaching and learning.
So now let's transition into talking about contemporary exemplars of spiritual leaders, reformers, educationalists, particularly someone like Pandurang Shastri Athavale, a spiritual leader, a reformer, social reformer, and also an educationalist who found wisdom in these philosophies, but modernized them into contemporary classrooms because they existed in models of ashrams for centuries. But to prepare young people to battle not only their personal lives to support their families, but also to battle the societal and socioeconomic situations that they're from, was also a post-colonial calling. So in that era of post-independence India, when a lot of imperialist nations had colonized Asia and Africa for centuries, and now in that 20th century period, countries were finding their independence. In this era in India, casteism, sexism, various isms had seeped into the blood and mentality of folk all over the country, from all the way to the top of bureaucracy and aristocrats to the most rural of farmers. And one fundamental thing that he noticed was, until an individual experience a sense of dignity that is profound beyond what they own, their last name, the color of their skin, this actualization and potential that these spiritual philosophies proclaim cannot be experienced. And so he attached this dignity to this divine consciousness that was proclaimed in these philosophies, saying that, yes, there is trauma and oppression involved with every single person that walks into a classroom or walks into an arena of learning. But beyond just accepting and affirming this background or heritage that this individual comes from, but attaching their identity to something that is beyond a material object, that now empowers them. It expands their sense of identity and is inclusive of everybody else. And as a result, building schools in nature-oriented areas allows them to strip them of the conforms of bounded thinking, of, you can only think like this because you are not allowed to read such literature based on your last name. You are not given access to a certain line of thinking because of a certain religion or a certain gender. When this classroom is broken into just nature, then one is allowed to expand their creative thinking and accept this source of spirituality. This spirituality is provided through a paradigm. It's not just provided through a meditation practice. It is not just provided through reading a certain text. It is inherent in the environment through Socratic dialogue, through expression of self, whether it's through art, whether it's through science, whether it's through mathematics, whether it's through history. But fundamentally, the intent of the spiritual traditions is maintained. And that is that the inquiry into self leads to an extrapolation that provides an experience of oneness. And that is the basis of solving the crisis of the climate. Through these educational experiments, what he has shown is that people, even from the most underserved and marginalized communities, treat nature as a coexisting being. And so the activism is a byproduct of the spiritual seeking. When one seeks this oneness beyond just their identities that they have been told to accept, then they feel a sense of familial relationship with not only their neighbors in society, but the plant life, the animal life. And so serving them is an act of love, not an act of utility or not an act of sustenance just for the human race. And this is actually fundamental to any spiritual tradition, not just of Indian descent, but of West African, of Aborigines, of Native American. That nature and the environment is a mother that provides. And the consciousness that lies in these trees and these animals is the exact same consciousness that lies within me. But through deep inquiry, I can extrapolate this journey of learning through acts of empathy. And so the journey of educating for someone like Athavale or someone like Tagore, who developed his school Shanti Niketan in Eastern India, was first reality pedagogy, really. Reality pedagogy stems from the idea of accepting a student's reality of where they come from, what they've dealt with, their ancestry, their trauma, and then affirming their dignity for what it is, and then empowering them with a deeper sense of self. And that's why Tagore's quote, "Individuality is precious because only through it can we realize the universal," is the basis of these spiritual traditions. What you're trying to do through any of these practices is reach a level of pure subjectivity beyond what the weather, the sensations, the clothes, the thoughts, the emotions, and that ultimate experience, a sense of self. The goal of any of these enlightenment traditions is to experience this oneness, this interdependence. And so this transitions into how our classroom can become an ashram. It's not like the schools that we teach in or the universities that we're in or the homes that we're in is suddenly going to become mountain forest institutions. So how does our classroom adapt this exact way of thinking? And first and foremost, it's not through an intervention. There's a term recently highlighted known as McMindfulness. And the authors of this term have really suggested that the West in its capitalist structure strip spiritual practices from the East or any indigenous tradition, repurpose it, and then allow to maintain the structures of power that already exist. For instance, helping Wall Street bankers meditate so that they can trade faster, helping engineering students meditate so they just deal with the pressure. But this does not change the system itself. It just becomes a coping mechanism. And these spiritual traditions, although the consequence is calming and maintained cortisol levels and serotonin levels and a sense of self-satisfaction because of mirror neurons when students meditate together and pray together, the intent is not that. That is just a consequence. The intent, again, is the inquiry into self that leads to a level of empathy. That is the intent. So how do we do this? We adopt the paradigm. How do we adopt the paradigm? A paradigm can be really summarized in three things: the approach and intent, which we just highlighted, the application, and the environment. Now, what is the application? The application is doing meditative contemplative practices, allowing Socratic and co-generative dialogue between the educator and the student about what is the nature of inquiry? What is my relationship with the universe? And finally, a level of self-expression. Tagore, or any spiritual tradition really, whether it's Sufism or the spiritual traditions of the East or the mystic traditions of the Abrahamic religions, all have a sense of self-expression through art. The mystics, the ones who have found some deep sense of self through this inquiry, express it through poetry, through writing, through painting. Because art is the fundamental expression that one can share through this deep insight. Whether it's writing in a journal, introspective writing, whether it's painting, writing a piece of a literature, a poem, through the balanced act of inquiry conversations, introspective journalism, self-expression through art, meditative practice, we allow for a paradigm shift in how we're teaching. It's not just interventional. Every activity we do in a classroom is oriented with that approach. And finally, the aspect of nature. Nature becomes the classroom and the content. It becomes where we teach. We can take lessons into the local environment, into the local neighborhood. That's not only affirming the neighborhoods and the culture the students come from, but allows them to extrapolate the content that we teach into those neighborhoods and their environment. It's both an affirmation and an activism at the same time. And that's exactly the approach of these spiritual traditions, that nature becomes the classroom, but not only the classroom, the environment, but the content. You see aspects of the history of the land. You see aspects of science that you learn in the classroom. When you see them, you think about your relationship with that thing. And as a result, that oneness develops. The empathy that we were talking about earlier becomes actualized. The inquiry conversations, the deep meditation and concentration practices can be externalized by teaching in and about the nature. And as a result, the sustenance, the climate sustainability concerns of teaching science and post-secondary and secondary classrooms is solved when we teach with this intent and approach. The approach then towards nature does not become utilitarian.
So we just talked about how this, the contemplative pedagogies stemming from the traditions of the East is relevant in our classrooms. And so to conclude, to discuss the hope and the scope of really this conversation, it's asking back to the calling and the crises that young people will face today. The idea is that applying a paradigm inspired by the spirituality of these philosophies alters our approach to climate and sustainability. Not only that, it alters our approach to the crises of mental health inequities that are highlighted in today's era. Now, although we're talking about these paradigms as a shift in our view of these ills that we experience, they're not band-aids. As Purser argues in McMindfulness, the West has this ability to adopt a spiritual practice from any tradition, repurpose it, and then sell it like their own, and make it so the structures that already exist continue to exist. For instance, meditation for inner city kids, meditation for people in Wall Street in high pressure environments, meditation for engineering students who have very high pressure demanding assessments. The idea isn't that these systems continue to exist and we just cope with them by meditating and calming. The calming and the coping mechanism is not the intent of this paradigm. It is a consequence of these spiritual philosophies. It is not a way to maintain this maladjustment. If deep inquiry is to occur, then a deep inquiry into self is first. And that requires us to make us understand our allegiances to already existing systems that do not let us shift our view. For instance, office buildings have shifted in the last century. How people dress has shifted every decade, every year almost. How people talk. But what has not shifted in over a century is how a classroom looks today. The brick walls, the tables, the chairs, the chalkboard. How can that be the case if we are to adapt and address these crises that young people will not only be able to face, but transform their face for the generation after them? So when we say our classroom is an ashram, and it is a little pushy, a little provocative, in some sense, that is its intent. It forces us to think about how we educate, not only in our classrooms, in our lecture halls, as leaders, as psychologists, as scholars, as family members, as parents, but to think about how, when we're the leader, how am I also the student? This deep inquiry begins with me. And only then does this paradigm get fully adopted. It is not just about doing a meditation practice in a classroom. When these practices are stripped from their cultural and philosophical context, they do nothing but uphold the capitalist power structures that already exist. They do not question the oppression or the mismanagement or the misuse of nature and environment. Only when they full package the intent, the approach of yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, or any of these spiritual traditions applied based on the pathways that have existed through these educational reformers, then only can we claim that our classroom is on the pathway to becoming an ashram. So this questioning, this inquiry really starts with us, the leaders. So let's take inspiration and some blessing from the ancestors who've attempted and exemplified this before us, and really take it from here. And of course, if you have any questions or ideas, or we just want to build, then feel free to reach out. Always open to conversation and inspiration from all of you. That's my email. And hopefully you have a very fruitful experience at the conference today. Learning from all of you.